Back in the 1970s and probably 1980s, almost every comedy movie wanted to have Jay Leno on scene. Like, come on, the one guy that could make you laugh just by his voice alone. He even featured on The Tonight Show, not as a guest, but rather as the host for more than a decade. Leno later had his own show, one he called Jay Leno's Garage, where he talked about the large fleet of cars and bikes he owned. In today's video, we'll find out just how many awesome and super fancy bikes Leno has. Believe me when I say his oldest bike is more than a century old. One of the very first bikes you'll find in Jay Leno's garage is his 1929 Scott Flying Squirrel, a masterpiece from the early 20th century that was made by the Scott Motorcycle Company, who decided to give it a heavy deal of specs, 'cause why not? The Flying Squirrel uses a 596cc two-stroke engine, which, being water-cooled, was pretty advanced for the 1920s. Even better was that rather than using a mechanical water pump like most bikes around that time, it used a thermosiphon cooling system that sort of worked by moving the coolant around through heat convection, and in the process, helping the engine. Leno's own bike was a TT replica, designed to look a lot like the bike that came third at the Isle of Man TT in 1929. It was stripped down to the essentials of a race bike. No headlights, turn signals, or brake lights. It's really unclear how Leno still got it registered for road use in California. Besides its 3-speed manual transmission, the Flying Squirrel did pretty well on performance, hitting speeds as high as 70 miles per hour. Leno, while showing the bike off on the Jay Leno's Garage show, spoke about how smooth it was, with barely any engine vibration when it was on. Another bike featured in Jay Leno's Garage show was his 1974 Norton John Player Special. This bike was a high-end model inspired by Norton's racing team and was sponsored by John Player cigarettes. He definitely went all out for this bike when he spent $3,000 on it. However, was it worth it? The bike was powered by an 828cc parallel twin that delivered 60 horsepower, which wasn't too bad for a bike from the 70s. Plus, the engine was rubber-mounted to prevent any vibrations and to make the ride super smooth. Add its full fairing with twin headlights and a race-ready look, and voila. Leno's Norton was one of the models built before September 1974. And how does that make it any special? Let's connect the dots. This Norton used the traditional British setup, with the rear brake pedal on the left and the gear shifter on the right. After September of 1974, Norton flipped the whole setting to match the US standards, putting the brake on the right and the shifter on the left. In other words, Leno has one of the very few left-sided brake models. It also had those Union Jack graphics on the tail section, which added a tiny bit of British racing vibe to the whole look. Now tell me, was it worth the $3K? Another bike Leno owns is the 1930 Indian Chief motorcycle. Leno got this bike more than 40 years ago, which was just around the time when it was called a bad bike. Why? Well, the Indian Chief had a very terrible shape. It crashed, got neglected, and was quite literally falling apart. Like, come on, even he, Leno, describes it as the biggest piece of junk. Considering its long list of issues, you might just see why. While it ran on a 1200cc air-cooled V-twin, the Indian Chief wasn't too bad on power, hitting an easy 45 horsepower and a bit of a low-end torque. Riding it probably was fun, but the problems it came with sorta made things annoying. It has a hard-tail frame, meaning there was no rear suspension, and so the rider felt every pump he passed over. We should probably add its spring seat, foot-operated clutch, and its infamous suicide clutch, which was a hand-shifted gear lever. Like, really, there isn't any comfort. When he wanted to restore the bike, Leno had them add a few interesting features, like the lock and stitch process, which helped to repair the damaged castings without replacing them entirely. Even now, almost a century old, the Indian Chief can still ride on streets, maybe with a few breakdowns, though. Another bike that really stands out in Jay Leno's collection is the 1975 Suzuki RE5, the one bike that welcomed him to the world of Suzukis. The RE5 had a 4.997cc Wankel engine that produced 62 horsepower and about 55 pounds of torque. The engine's triangular rotor design, developed after World War II, was praised for being really smooth and vibration-free. The bike also had some cool features, including a liquid cooling system for added reliability and a two-stage, two-barrel Mikuni carburetor. It offered both electric and kickstart options and used a 5-speed transmission for an easy ride. It also has this cylindrical instrument cluster with the speedometer and tachometer, quite the tech for a 1975 two-wheeler. But here's the thing. Even though the RE5 had some top-of-the-market tech, it wasn't exactly on top of that market. It just wasn't the best bike. The fuel consumption was on the higher side, and buyers back then weren't quite ready for something so different or modern. Plus, its complex engine made it difficult to repair or even manage. Today, the RE5 is more of one heck of a relic than an actual street bike, being valued around $10,000 if it is in good condition. Sometimes the classier the name, the classier the bike, and in the case of the Lenos Harley-Davidson Cafe Racer designed by Patrick Godet, it gets even better. This bad boy was a modern twist of the legendary Vincent Black Shadow bike from the 1950s. The Harley-Davidson Cafe Racer was powered by a 998cc V-twin, which made it the fastest two-wheeler when it came out. When a Swiss guy, Fritz Egli, got the opportunity to improve the bike, he redesigned it solely to improve its rigidity. Then in 2000s, and Patrick Godet, who loved the Vincent, met Egli and they decided to up the bike again. Godet boosted the engine size to 1,330cc and added dual Mikuni carburetors, altogether raising the bike's output to around 100 horsepower. They also rebuilt the bike with a solid, reinforced tubular steel frame, Triumph telescopic forks, and twin shock absorbers. For stopping power, they gave it twin 10-inch front disc brakes and a 7-inch rear drum brake. The Harley-Davidson Cafe Racer never really had many reports of issues, nor did it ever call apart, so it's pretty clear why it's one of the best bikes in Jay Leno's collection. You know, the Vincent Black Prince bike was probably the best two-wheeler of the 20th century when it was called the Bentley on two wheels. It rode on a 998cc V-twin that produced around 55 horsepower and helped the bike reach a max speed of 120 miles an hour. Paired with a 4-speed gearbox for a smooth ride, its full enclosure design protects the rider from the elements and, of course, adds a bit of flair to the whole look. Now, the front suspension has Vincent's hydraulic oil-damped forks, which were pretty new at the time the bike came out, while the rear suspension used a cantilever monoshock system. Let's not forget the pretty awesome paint job it got and the luxurious finishes that gave it this polished, high-tech look. The Black Prince was produced in an 11-year period between 1954 and 1955, with only about 200 units being made. Despite its ultra-modern outlook, it came with a couple of problems, including issues with its fiberglass components, and then there were the financial troubles that led to the company closing in December 1955. For a car guy like Jay Leno, the Vincent Black Prince isn't just one heck of a ride. It is the perfect ride, a super rare piece of motorcycle history. He showed it off in his YouTube series where he explained the whole history and the brains behind the bike. Today, you can find this bike at a price as high as $100,000. Now, let's talk about Jay Leno's Velocette Thruxton, a bike from what we might call the glory days of British motorcycling. The fact that the Velocette company shut down the same year Leno got his hands on these bikes makes it even more special. It was one of the last buys the company ever had. But what's so awesome about the Thruxton that made Nike enthusiasts hush over it? Well, let's start with its engine. The Thruxton used a 499cc single-cylinder engine that effortlessly made 41 horsepower at 6,200 revs per minute. While it doesn't even stand a chance against today's bike numbers, it was really okay for a 70s bike. It had a square bore and stroke, both measuring 86 millimeters, that gave it a smooth blend of power and torque, about 33 pounds-feet, to be exact. Paired with a 4-speed gearbox, it jams the brakes at a max speed of 110 miles per hour. The bike was actually designed to be a race bike. Clip-on handlebars, a lightweight frame, and that spot-on black and silver paint job. The twin leading shoe front brake and adjustable rear suspension also added to its abilities, helping it with its handling. Indeed, the Thruxton was known for its endurance. When it came out, it could go at 100 miles an hour for more than 24 hours without breaking down. Even today, not all bikes can pull that off. Leno's Magola touring motorcycle, built by German engineer Fritz Cockerell, used a 640cc 5-cylinder rotary engine that sat just inside the front wheel. Yep, an engine in the front wheel. With this, there was no clutch or gearbox because the engine drove the wheel, oozing out 14 horsepower and taking the bike to a top speed of about 75 miles per hour. One issue with the Magola was how you get fuel to the engine. It didn't use the regular fuel pump, and instead, riders had to hand pump fuel from the main tank hidden in the frame to a smaller pre-tank up front, and then leave it all to gravity to do its thing. It was an old-school design, but it actually helped keep the bike's weight well distributed. Handling the Magola was a whole different experience. Because of the front-wheel drive arrangement, it had a tendency to pull to the left when you hit the throttle. The torque steer phenomenon, as they called it. There wasn't even a push-button ignition. To turn on the bike, you had to hit it on its stand and spin the front wheel to get it going. Unlike his other bikes, Leno's Magola Touring debuted at the 2012 Pebble Beach Concours d'Elegance. Only 2,000 sets of this bike were ever made, and there are only 15 left today. Finally, let's talk about probably Jay Leno's oldest bike, the 1918 Pope Model L motorcycle. This one was made by the Pope Manufacturing Company in Westfield, Massachusetts, between 1914 and 1920, which technically means it's more than a century old. But despite how old it was, performance was never a debate. The Model L is almost literally a motorcycle legend. It could hit speeds up to 70 miles per hour, which was way higher than a lot of bikes made in the 50s or even 60s. In fact, it was the fastest bike in the world when it came out in 1914. For the engine, you've got a 998cc overhead valve V-twin that produces about 15.4 horsepower. It had iron cylinders and an aluminum crankcase, which was some really advanced engineering for the WWI period. Let's not forget its 3-speed transmission and the chain drive. Most motorcycles used the traditional belt drives around that time. Oh, and there's the suspension system, which had a leaf spring set up in the front and twin coil springs in the back. There isn't so much info on when Leno bought this particular bike, or if he ever crashed it, or had to do crazy repairs on it. Still, the fact that it is still in his garage today is just astounding. A century-old bike like that could be worth several $100,000 at auction. If you liked this video, give it a thumbs up and hit the subscribe button so we can update you on all our upcoming content. Also, comment what celebrity car collection you want us to do next. We'll catch you in the next one.